Here's John Lennox to insist that Christianity is entirely compatible with science.
Are science and religion in conflict?
Science has nothing to say about the supernatural, so in that sense, science does not conflict with religion. Insofar as religious people oppose the conclusions of science, those religious people do conflict with science.
I don't really think so. And I've had that impression actually for a very long time, in the sense that when I was at school, I started reading C.S. Lewis. My father gave me some of his books. And it was very interesting reading those books because his take on the history of science, which was based on Alfred North Whitehead actually, was, to quote more or less, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver.
There is no need to presuppose that physical laws exist in order to do science. Science investigates whether there are regularities and laws in nature, but makes no presuppositions at all about whether they are there or not. If it were the case that people were inspired to become scientific because they expected there to be laws, and they expected there to be laws because they believed in a lawgiver, then science would define its laws as behests. Science does not define its laws as being behests. They are merely descriptions of regularities that have been observed to be consistent.
That fascinated me. And a little bit more research showed me that if you take modern science, I'm not talking about medieval science, modern science, and you start with people like Galileo, and then you move on to Kepler, Newton, and so on. These people were all believers in God with slight variations on it. And it seemed to me there was a pretty close connection between their theism and their approach to science.
Lennox's examples of modern science seem to end almost 400 years ago. Atheism among actually living scientists is much higher than among the general population, so belief in God can't be very important to doing science. Lennox talks as though he thinks that without belief in God, science would never have gotten off the ground. The fact that early scientists shared the overwhelmingly dominant views of their time is poor evidence of that, and even if the specific examples he cites were religiously inspired, that's clearly not necessary in order to do science given how common atheism is among scientists today.
And in general, historians of science, and when I came to Oxford after a while, I worked for a time with John Hedley Brooke, who was the first professor of science and religion here, and a wonderful historian.
Yeah.
And he was very cautious, but he said there certainly does seem to be a connection between the biblical worldview and the rise of modern science. So sometimes I say to people who ask me that question that I'm not remotely ashamed of being a scientist, if you count mathematicians as scientists, and a Christian, because arguably it was the Judeo-Christian worldview that gave me my subject.
That would only make any sense if math, as a subject, didn't exist prior to Judaism. This is obviously not the case. Even after the invention of Judaism, a lot of the earliest math was developed outside of its geographical sphere of influence.
This question of the history of science,
yes,
and it being tied up with the Christian worldview is an interesting one, because to me it's slightly different to asking whether the findings of science after the scientific method gets off the ground conflict with the sort of tenets of religious belief. And so I think what a lot of people will think is, okay, the founders of the scientific method were Christian.
If a lot of people think that, then a lot of people are wrong. An important aspect of the scientific method is empiricism, which was promoted by Chinese, Indian, and Greek philosophers long before Christianity began.
But of course they were, because everyone was Christian. And if science does somehow undermine Christianity, then of course they would be Christians, because they hadn't invented the scientific method yet to undermine it. And so people will point to the findings of science and say that the explanatory power that these Christian men who wanted to understand the universe found in the scientific method removes the space needed for the explanatory power of God.
Well, God has no explanatory power. An explanation will help you make falsifiable predictions. The idea of God can't do that. The principle of falsifiability, by the way, a very important contribution to how we do science, was developed by Karl Popper, who was an agnostic.
Modern science did not develop among the Chinese.
The word modern is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. The Chinese philosophy of Moism, for example, promoted empiricism over fatalism, so they did develop some elements of modern science. I suspect Lennox may be defining modern science as whichever aspects of science were not developed by the Chinese.
And a lot of study was done on that particular topic by a very famous sinologist who actually, did he found the Academy of Sciences in China? And I'm wrestling for his name. You probably know it.
I'm not sure I do.
But he did a lot of research, and he was principally a Marxist in his viewpoint.
Mhm.
And that is what makes his conclusion very interesting. He certainly was the author of a massive dictionary of scientific science and all that. He tried to explain within a Marxist framework why modern science of the type you described
Right.
didn't arise in China. And the conclusion he came to was it was a difference in a fundamental presupposition of the idea that there was a unification in the sense that there was one creator who had created the universe and created the human mind to study it.
I doubt that, but let's say that's true. Even if it was the case that people developed science because they believed in a creator, the reason why so many people see a conflict between Christianity and science is because many of the conclusions that can be rationally drawn from the scientifically collected evidence contradict claims made by Scripture. For the last several hundred years, religious people and institutions have tried to prevent these claims from being taught and punished scientists for making them in the first place.
When I think about someone like Galileo, an important founder of the scientific method, and I think about the way that he's treated by the reigning Catholic authorities for presenting an alternate view of the world, although not proving it, arguably, at the time, running into a bit of trouble and ending up finishing his life in house arrest in Tuscany.
Rather luxurious house
Yeah,
arrest.
it's quite. He got it quite well, I think.
Yes, let's downplay the overt suppression of science by the church.
I think that using Galileo as an example
Mhm.
doesn't work, because if you look at what actually happened, the first people to criticize Galileo was not the Catholic Church. It was the philosophers who were building on Aristotle and believed in a fixed earth. And the church got involved rather foolishly because it had climbed on the Aristotelian bandwagon.
Yes.
It's interesting how much of Christian philosophy, especially in the Middle Ages, was influenced by the non-Christian Aristotle, and apologists will sometimes give Christianity credit for things like the development of logic, despite the fact that they largely took it from Aristotle. But when it comes to the persecution of Galileo, oh well, that's just the fault of people taking Aristotle too seriously.
Some of these archetypal scientific revolutions, the Copernican revolution, the revolution of biology with natural selection and Charles Darwin, even things like the revolutions in physics with quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Do you think that any of these pose any challenges to, say, the Christian worldview? Is there anything about the Christian worldview that you think is at least challenged by these scientific developments?
Well, we need to take them separately.
Sure.
And certainly, as one person has said, at least one, that Darwinism proved to be an engine of atheism.
Yes. Well, I think this is the most important example here, is probably evolution.
The opposition of some Christians and Christian institutions to evolution may be the biggest reason why people think that Christianity is in conflict with science more generally.
It is.
Yeah.
Quantum mechanics actually, to take your other example, for some people, opened up the possibility of freedom and all the business of giving, to put it this way, which I don't really like, space for God, so to speak.
You mean it opened up a gap for God? I think it actually undermines some of the arguments for God, because there are arguments that say that the universe is deterministic, and therefore, in order for free will to exist, there must be supernatural intervention. Quantum mechanics shows that not everything in nature is deterministic, and non-deterministic events do not require divine intervention.
The idea that there is a creator God is not going to be refuted by a biological theorem.
No, but the claim that God molded the first human out of dust has been thoroughly refuted by many biological theorems.
I'm not even convinced they're in the same kind of category.
Mm-hmm.
That, in other words, evolution, whatever it does, and I'm saying that quite deliberately, whatever it does, is not an argument against the involvement of a creator.
It is an argument against the necessity of a creator to explain the diversity and complexity of life.
I spoke to one very leading, well-known biologist who is a strong believer in evolution and is a Christian. And I said to him, in the end, if I'm pushed to it, God can do it any way he liked. So that if it happens to be that way, that is not an argument against the existence of God.
In other words, the involvement of God is completely indistinguishable from the absence of any such involvement. That renders the claim that God was involved to be non-falsifiable and therefore meaningless.
Any more than the existence of an automatic self-winding watch, which uses random motions of your arm to wind itself up, is an argument against the existence of an intelligent watchmaker.
Mm-hmm.
That calling in of randomness doesn't get rid of God at all. But of course, if you're going to use evolution as an argument against God, first of all, you've got to know that evolution is true and you've got to define what it does.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing.
I assure you we're well past that, but atheists who bring up evolution don't typically say that it's an argument against God per se. The point is that God is not necessary to explain the diversity and complexity of life.
And here you run into very many more difficulties now than you would have done 20 years ago.
Right.
And I just make 2 points, and they're quite important points. And that is, we need to distinguish between evolution and the origin of life.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of people who seem to have trouble doing that are creationists. A common rebuttal that creationists make to evolution is that evolution can't explain how life began. This is not an argument against evolution because the theory doesn't even try to explain this.
Now, Richard Dawkins, as you know, who's a brilliant writer, I must say, I remember reading his book, The Blind Watchmaker.
Yes.
And what arrested me in reading it, and I can almost quote it verbatim, so that's a compliment to Richard, that evolution, the blind automatic mechanism that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and the development of all of life.
He said that.
Yes, it's in the book.
Yeah, Dawkins says a lot of silly things. You can't explain the existence of self-replicating nucleotide chains, which is what life is essentially, with evolution because self-replication has to already occur in order for natural selection to take place. You need chemistry to explain the development of the first life form.
He could see that something was happening that filled niches and enabled existing creatures to adapt to new niches. Now, that seems to me to be uncontroversial because we can observe it. But when it goes beyond that to the creation, if I might use that word, of new life forms or all this kind of thing, I think that's a very different matter.
It's not. If by new life forms you mean new species, we can observe that as well. I suspect, however, that Lennox may define the evolution of new life forms as the level of development that cannot be observed on human timescales. Such developments, however, are still only different in degree and not in category. It is not a different matter.
And I have a huge difficulty with that kind of what we may call macroevolution. But much more interestingly, is what has happened in the last few years with so-called systems biology, where the Darwinian mechanism, well, natural selection was his, mutation was later. But if we put both together and we have the neo-Darwinian hypothesis, that has been called into very deep question as being totally inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
Not by the vast majority of evolutionary biologists, it hasn't.
Here in Oxford, Denis Noble, one of the most fascinating characters, fellow of the Royal Society, and he's debated Richard on a number of occasions. And his argument is really in the end that natural selection, that neo-Darwinian thesis, doesn't need to be modified. It needs to be replaced because it's completely inadequate.
Yeah, Denis Noble's ideas aren't taken very seriously by most biologists, but even he isn't a creationist. He argues that mutations are deterministically acquired rather than random, but he doesn't claim that God is guiding them.
Because now, and here I'm just saying what I read, the problem is, and it's a chicken the egg problem, that most simply perhaps can be realized. Here is DNA. You can't get DNA without a cell.
Evolution doesn't start with DNA. It starts with simpler self-replicating nucleotide chains that don't need a cell.
You can't get a living cell without DNA. So how does that work?
You can actually get a living cell without DNA. A cell is just a self-replicating nucleotide chain surrounded by a phospholipid bilayer. Self-replicating nucleotide chains are life even if they are not contained within a cell. But all it takes to make it a cell is to surround it with a cell wall.
And what seems to me to be happening, and I've actually written quite a lot about this in a recent book, Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix, that there appears to be a top-down causation, and it leads to a huge problem because it was enough level of complexity to discover that the DNA molecule was not simply complex, it was linguistically complex.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it gave us a 3.4 billion letter long word in a chemical alphabet.
Calling it a word or calling its complexity linguistic doesn't make it the product of a consciousness.
And all those letters had to be in the right order. That is a stupendous level of complexity.
Actually, the letters don't all have to be in the right order. There are mutations called silent mutations that don't change the amino acid sequence of the proteins they produce.
Which is no chance of being generated by random processes.
They weren't generated exclusively by random processes. Natural selection is not random.
And Richard Dawkins agrees with that. He brings in something that natural selection actually has a different kind of operation, but we're not going to that at the moment.
Then what's the point of this argument?
But the point is now, with the more recent discoveries of the nature of the living cell and all the chemical factories in it, there are levels upon levels of complexity beyond the genome. And that just beggars into unbelief, the possibility that any known mechanism can produce that without the input of intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
This is an argument from incredulity. There is absolutely nothing about complexity that requires intelligence. Why can't unconscious processes produce complexity? Why can't they produce complexity that has very specific consequences? The idea that this requires an intelligence just seems like a baseless assumption. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.